Welcome everybody. This is our last 2023 summer session, so to speak. We had a lot of fun this summer. We had some great speakers who come talk about some pretty deep topic like Gen AI, which is pretty hot topic with Eric Gorza, and we had some more fun with Lou from some book reading for service design. And today we're going to be talking to Stephen Anderson, who's also a bit of a lighter side of service design. We're going to try to have a bit more fun as we close up the summer of service design here. Very quickly, do some stuff. So as always, thank you to our sponsors, Slalom and Precocity, who have been sponsoring us and helping us get this content to you over the past, I think, 3 or 4 years now. I don't know how many sessions we have done so far virtual, but since the beginning of COVID, so I think we have about 50 or 60 sessions. So if you have joined us in the past, thank you so much. If this is the first time today, welcome. Again, this is Service Design Network Dallas chapter, but we obviously have now expanded to more areas in the world. So again, my name is Greg Lacloufie, and we also have with us Brandon, Robin, and Brenda, and we are Service Design Network. Thank you for joining us and following us and helping us spread the knowledge and experience of service design throughout the world. As I said, today's going to be a recording session as usual. If you have missed past sessions, feel free to go to our YouTube channel and catch up on some of the speakers we've had, like Andy Pollen, Jim Kalbach, Mark Fontaine, Erica Hall, Mark Stigdorn. I think we have about 50 of them now, so feel free to go back and look at some topics. We try to cover a wide range of topics, from futurism to blueprinting to some more fun and light stuff like portfolios and stuff like that. So go ahead and go to our YouTube channel and catch up on some service design content. As Brenda was mentioning a second ago, if you are welcome to use the chat to talk to each other, engage with us, discuss, share. If you do have a specific question for Stephen, make it obvious to us so we can actually capture that and leave him alone when he does his presentation, and we can actually ask him those questions in about 30-40 minutes. So make it pretty obvious to us the question for Stephen, and we can just capture those for you. Today, we're going to be doing a bit of a lighter side of service design. We're going to be talking about designing with playfulness, which is a lot of the time service design is hard. Like we talked to Megan Miller last week, and she was very vocal about the fact that doing service design is difficult. It is not easy, and it requires a lot of different skills. One of them can actually be playfulness, right? We talked in the past about having different kind of activities you can do to facilitate. It doesn't have to be difficult, it doesn't have to be complex, it doesn't have to be strenuous on the audience. And recently, I was just in Boston last week, for example, and I went to the gift store of the Boston ICA, and there was a whole bunch of cards, for example. There's a card for everything, right? You have some really cool stuff about stoicism, and those are kind of really easy doing stuff. I personally have some sets of cards, and we share those. Like I have those a few minutes of design. I don't know if my things are letting me do that. So these are really great cards for you to use either individually for your teams or with your clients. I also have, for example, 75 tools. Well, this is going to be a problem, but that's okay. 75 tools for creative thinking. So a lot of cool cards you can go through. And of course, the granddaddy of them all, which is the ideal method cards. So a lot of cool card sets out there for designers, but you can do more, right? So today we're going to talk to Stephen. I'm going to give a few seconds to introduce himself, because in case you haven't met him or listened to him in the past, he does a lot of like speaking arrangement everywhere, but Stephen has been with us several times now. I haven't lost keep track of it, but Stephen, you have a few minutes to introduce yourself to our audience, and I will let you talk to us about how we can do some really cool activities using some card decks to facilitate a workshop, to help our stakeholders or business users or champions to kind of like go through some exercise that can be pretty complicated, but we can actually make it very simple for them. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you for hosting me. And you all know this is going to be more of like a show and tell. I was chatting ahead of time with Greg. I said, I have this super niche project I'm working on that I'd love to share with people and get feedback and start a conversation around. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll get excited as well if you're not already there. I have to say, though, that photo you shared of all those card decks, awesome. Where was that at again?
Where was what?
The photo of the card
It
decks.
was in the Boston Contemporary Museum in a Boston seaport, and they had a whole bunch of cool cards. And I've seen those before, but there was some pretty cool ones there.
Yeah, I recognized a lot of them. There were a few in there. I was like, "Ooh, what card deck's that? I'm gonna have to add it to my collection." So I took a screenshot, which is this is my addiction. So if I can share my screen, I'll go ahead and get started.
Go for it.
All right. Yeah. So there's a project I've been working on called How Cards Work, and I'll explain what that is in just a moment. But first, to set the stage. I love all of these. I don't know if you call them knowledge cards, learning cards, but the kind of cards that you had in that photo, Greg. So you have like tools for creative thinking, the tarot cards of tech, what's worth doing, all these wonderful card decks. And that aren't necessarily games, like they're not pure games, but they do have the element of play and playfulness and gamefulness to them. Yeah, all sorts of things and things adjacent to cards like notebooks and other things. And you'll see how this kind of expands. And then not pictured in here is my absurd collection of board games proper. I'm just not going to go there, but you can imagine a closet filled with games, and you've got the start of the picture. So if you ever want to call me the card guy, I am fine with that label. I will embrace that and be happy with that for years to come. But what I've noticed, or what I'm interested in, is cards as a medium. So we talk a lot about different, even sticky notes. There's a book on sticky notes and how to use sticky notes, right? Or Post-it notes. There's books on paper and all these things. We don't talk about cards, like the little, mostly rectangle things as a medium very often. It rarely comes up. And I've noticed at least three things. So outside of board games, there aren't a lot of creative uses of cards. And I'll show you what I mean in a moment. When it comes to designing with cards and card decks, there's a lack of literacy on cards as a medium. And there's no established pattern language or reference guide to inspire creative ideas. So this is what I'm out to solve. I found a few people talking about this stuff here and there, but there isn't a source, there isn't a book, there isn't a toolkit to talk about how to use cards or how to work with cards as a medium. And this interest started a few years ago where I've been into cards for 10, 15 years at least, but I was doing some coaching and helping someone else with a card project, and just some basic things like treating a card as a discrete unit of information that can be remixed were kind of taken for granted. I had taken those for granted as I watched this person number the cards so they would read like a book. I'm like, no, that's not how cards work. If you want that, make a book, right? But cards are remixable and resortable, and you can flip them and rotate them and do all these things. So through the process of coaching, I became aware of a lot of things I had just picked up implicitly and kind of taken for granted. So a bit about, before I go on, I just want to know, and you can respond in the chat, what about you? Where are you on cards? And if on one end, we have the confused Jeff Goldblum who's like, cards? Really? And on the other end, we have cards. Wow, awesome. Just type in the message, where do you fall, or how do you feel about cards? Know who I'm speaking with. Cards, all caps. Christina, thank you. Cards. Agile cards. Yeah. Some of you may use cards in the form of poker planning if you're on a tech team. Yep. Yet to form opinion. Fantastic. All right. Keep it coming. Keep it coming. I'll check on that. So a little bit of my story. So coming up on 15 years ago, I self-published a deck of cards called the Mental Notes Card Deck. And the idea was, at the time, we weren't talking about how to bring psychology to web design or app design. And I was reading a lot of books at the time, books like Predictably Irrational, Nudge, A Theory of Fun for Game Design, and picking up all these ideas and research and lessons about human behavior and things we do. And I started just taking notes on index cards. This is circa 2007, I believe. And those eventually became this card deck that I self-published. And it was 52 ideas from psychology that we can apply to game design. The inspiration, by the way, going way back before, was Roger Von Eck's Creative Whack Pack. So you can actually see even in the layout a little bit of the influence there. But those are my sources. And basically how I would teach people to use the cards in the workshop would be kind of to complete this phrase. So how can we use, and then you would draw a principle. So how can we use the idea of curiosity to accomplish a certain goal? And so that was 2009, almost 15 years ago. Next year might be a good time to do a 15th anniversary reprint since they're out of print. Maybe that'll happen. We'll see. But one of the things I've noticed since, and my own card deck, Mental Notes, is guilty of this, is there's just a lot of what I would call basic and boring cards out there. So the IDEO method cards, my own Mental Notes cards, the Creative Whack Pack, even, the writing those oblique strategies, they're all like, there's roughly 50, 60 cards, whatever that seems to be a nice deckish number, right? And they all are like methods, or they're all like lenses, or they're all like the same uniform thing. And maybe they get a little bit more creative and there's like, types or categories added, but that's about it, right? That's as far as we go. Even all of these too are guilty of having the backside has the logo, right? And then the other side has all the information. So they're not even using both sides of the card. To go to the other extreme, and I want to show you a photo from a game called Seven Wonders. So this is a board game, a card-based board game. And just looking at the cards in this picture, I want you to tell me, what patterns do you notice? Like, you don't have to know anything about the game. You may have never played it, but just looking at this, if you were to walk up and start glancing, just type in some things in the chat that you notice looking at this photo, as far as the patterns go. Color, icons, grouping by color. Yep. Stacking, building on things. Color-coded sequence, lots of icons. Yeah. Iconography. Even the stacking, you'll notice it's kind of staggered. And that's so you can see this information that hangs down the left edge. Yep. Building a tableau. Yep. And then visible, larger structure. If you look at these cards, you'll notice they're face down, tucked under this player board, right? So there's a pattern there. Yeah, lots of stuff going on. And that's really what I'm interested in. What I want to talk more about is, what are some of the patterns you see in a game like this? And how can they be applied to everyday, whether it's workshop activities or self-reflection activities or service design activities? How can we apply them to more serious games, those patterns? So that's really what I want to talk about. And I'm going to flip to my other computer, and I'm going to show you 4 case studies to kind of ground us in what I mean. And then I'm going to show you some of the patterns I've been identifying. And here we go. All right. So I'm going to go through 4 quick case studies. And with each, I'm going to go through kind of what it was about and then comment on the card pattern in use. So this first one, I gave a talk ages ago, I think it was 2009, and it was all about spotting bad problem statements. And the initial version of the talk, it was very much like a laundry list talk where I went through like 13 or 14 things. As the talk goes, it was kind of boring. The content was great. The information was great, but just wasn't a very engaging like keynote sort of talk. And so I decided to try and make it more interesting by adding a bingo sheet. So as people played along, as people were listening to the rather boring talk, they could play along and cross off things on this bingo sheet. It was a hack. It was a Band-Aid to try to make the talk interesting. And then through doing a workshop on this, I came across a different way to teach the same material. And I say teach in air quotes because really it was less about me teaching and more about me creating the structure for people to teach themselves, to learn on their own terms. And so I turned these, I think it was like 14 different patterns, bad problem statement patterns, into a card deck. And the way it worked was every card has 2 sides. So on one side, you have an example problem statement, and that's the blue side. And then if you flip it over, you have a definition of what the kind of bad problem statement is. Is that solutioneering? Is that future-proofing? Is that anchoring, narrowing the problem? What is it? And to make it more interesting, I mixed in a few good problem statements. So when you play this game, when you spread it all out, you have a bunch of problem statements. Going into it, most of these are bad. And the goal is kind of twofold. One, as a group, to identify which ones are bad and why, and also not get fooled by the ones that are actually pretty good problem statements, good problem framing. And what you see there is people have different strategies. Sometimes they'll sort them into definitely good, definitely bad piles, or they'll go one at a time and then flip it over. And it's great to see people, again, I use the word play this activity, because when they flip it over and they have that check yourself moment, did they call it right? Did they describe why this was a bad problem statement? You'll see entire tables of people go, oh, like they missed it. Oh, we got it, right? So there's this enthusiasm in just being able to check yourself. And in terms of learning, the real takeaway here is it moved from a very boring passive learning experience, even though the content was good, the delivery, the format wasn't right, to a place of active learning where people are playing this game and probably getting more out of the content than listening to me talk about it for 45 minutes. So the pattern in use, a very, very simple basic idea, was just using both sides and having kind of a check yourself, a flip pattern where you can flip and look at information on the other side. So very simple. Let's look at another use case. So distinguishing between facts and beliefs. This was a workshop on self-awareness that I was leading for a few years. And we would talk about the difference between, or differentiate between, facts and beliefs. But, beyond the easy examples that were provided, a lot of people still struggled with, is this a fact or belief, and some of the ideas. And so to make this more engaging, more interesting, we actually went through real questions people had about, real struggles they had in their organizations. And I went for the hardest questions, the most debatable ones, and turned those into a deck of cards. And we would have people basically spread out those cards, and they had to answer the question, is this a fact or is it a belief? And so let me give you some examples. And I'll give you a really easy one. These are the kinds of examples we'd put up on the slide deck. Stephen used slides in his talk. So it's a fact or a belief. Well, I'm using slides right now. It is a fact. I used Mural as well, but did I use slides? Yes. So it would go in the fact pile. But then you get things like fact or belief. Stephen gave the worst talk ever at Service Design Dallas. Fact or belief? Hopefully you put that in the belief pile, right? Not a fact, right? And then it would get really interesting. Fact or belief, to be successful, this project needs 3 people minimum. Again, these were the crowdsourced, real sorts of debatable things. And we would have the people at the table would discuss and debate this. And the debates would get pretty interesting. I was excluded from that meeting, fact or belief. And our research does not support this decision, fact or belief. And the new leader does not support this initiative. So I think you can see you may have encountered these same sorts of things at your place of work, fact or belief. And the teams would talk about this. This culture is resistant to change, fact or belief. And the whole exercise was just sort it into one of these piles, fact or belief. And I'm going to zoom in here. You'll notice there's a facts pile, there's a belief pile, and then there's a we're not sure pile. And this is just how it happened organically. The punchline in all of this is everything was always a belief. That's what we were trying to get people to recognize. And then there'd inevitably be debates like, what do you mean? That's not a belief. And we'd break it down and talk about why it was. Again, same sort of takeaway from passive learning on the slides. Let's go through fact or belief. Great. Now you're experts at this, to let's actually practice active learning and let's engage in a dialogue and debate in some cases around whether something's a fact or a belief. Simple pattern there was forced sorting. And I do want to comment, if this was built as an app that literally forced you to sort into A or B, you would lose out on that organic messiness that comes when people create like a category C or a spectrum, as we saw in some cases. This is something you can replicate through digital whiteboards online or in person, but an app would actually not allow for that interesting nuance and debate. So just wanted to call that out. Third use case, this is a product from Stuart Brand called The Thing from the Future. And basically you force or you collide ideas that maybe shouldn't go together to come up with a new idea. And so the way, there's actually 2 versions of this, the early version 1 and the version 2.0, which I'll show in just a moment. So basically there are 4 suits of cards. There are, I think I have them identified here. Yep. There's art cards. So this is how far out in the future is it? And was it like a growth future? Was it a collapse future? What type of future is it? A terrain card. So what's the domain, if you will? An object. And what's the mood or the tone? And basically you would draw 4 of these. And so you would say, in the future, in a 30-year future of continued growth, there's a postcard. We're excited about it and it has to do with education. What is it? Right? That's kind of how this would work. And of course, there's, dozens of cards for each of these suits. So the possible combinations are, near limitless. The version 2.0, he actually iterated and streamlined this a bit more and noticed over time that there's really like 2 of the cards could collapse into one, and you could actually string these together into more of a sentence. So in a blank future, there is a blank related to blank. What is it? And what's interesting, if we think about this structurally, there's kind of three levels. So it's not just random things, there's levels. There's the macro, meso, and micro. So in a macro feature, like a continued growth feature, there is a micro, that's the object, related to meso, the theme. And what Stuart Brand has learned is that just this sort of streamlined experience actually produces better results on the end. But I feel like there's two different patterns at play, and neither is good or bad. They're just different for different use cases. The first one, it was a little more creatively challenging. Like you have to find a connection between these four random things. With this new one, it's almost like a Mad Lib statement where you're randomly filling in the three blanks. And now you have to say it equals what? What's the natural equation? So in terms of patterns being used, that's forced combination is what I would call that there. There's probably another pattern as well with the version 2, forced combination in a linguistic sequence, a sequence that makes sense. So again, you can start to see these patterns that are at use behind these everyday card-based activities. Let me share one more. And first, I'll identify the problem. So I was so enamored with the flip pattern and the idea that you could have, like, say, for example, a problem on one side and the solution on the other, that I was like, great, I'm going to do a problem solution deck where the problems, maybe it's common work culture issues on one side and the solutions on the other side. The only problem is, in many cases, there's not one solution to complex problems. There's many potential things you could try, potential solutions. And so this pattern just didn't work. And I was stumped for a while, and it's one of those things I put in the back of my mind. I'm like, well, it doesn't work that cleanly, this pattern for complex problems. Months later, I came across the yoga card deck and stumbled across another pattern that's really interesting. So the deck has lots and lots of yoga poses, yoga activities, and things like that. But I want you to look to the lower right and notice what they have. They have in the beginning of the deck these kind of index cards or reference cards that say, okay, if you're a beginner, grab these numbered cards, and that's going to be your routine. If you want to work on these muscles, grab these cards, right? So it's almost like, here's the set of, but to go back to my problem solution analogy, here's a bunch of things you could try. And then there's index cards that say, here's the problem. For this problem, try maybe this set of cards. For this problem, try this. So that idea of like a one-to-many kind of index card or recipe or reference card, I was like, that's an interesting pattern. So there it goes, recipe pattern. So you're getting a feel for this and how these games are more than just the basic vanilla, basic boring, like list of 60 cards. Like these cards are being used in interesting and novel ways, and nothing out there, right? The rules can be learned in 30 seconds, right? There's nothing crazy about these. So where all this is headed is, these are 5 patterns. I'm going to show you more in just a minute. But I've been thinking about these patterns and as I've been playing different games and even capturing them, thinking about where do they come from. So the forced combination pattern is from games like Apples to Apples and Cards Against Humanity. There's another pattern I didn't call out here, or actually I did, the sequence, right? There's a game called Chronology, and there are other games like this where the goal is to sequence cards in a particular way. In this case, it's very literal. It's a timeline. So one card, again, there's an A-B pattern here as well. So one card is, when was the bikini introduced? And then you try to figure it out, and then you flip it over and you get the answer and you can see if you were right. So it's using an A-B pattern, a flip pattern, and kind of a sequence pattern. Things I didn't show you, but are ripe for potential. If we start playing with materials such as clear cards, there's all sorts of things you can do. So on the left, it's a game called Gloom, I believe. It has clear cards, and as you overlay stuff, it replaces or augments the information behind it. The one on the right is a kind of, you build your character by swapping out different cards that go behind it. So anyway, invisible cards, how could that be used in everyday activities? I don't have it here, but one of the card decks I'm looking at over to my left is a nature card deck where they have dozens of patterns you might find in nature, and each one is on a single clear card. And the idea is you go out into nature and you look for a certain pattern. You find that pattern in nature. And so the transparent card just fits the theme of that really well. And again, it's a present scene mindfulness sort of game. Here's one. I can't remember the name of the game this came from, but I looked at this. I'm like, wow, these cards form a mosaic. They have that flip pattern. So things go from this sort of monochromatic blue and white to like full color. I think it's a horror poltergeist themed game and you're trying to bring stuff into focus, but I could be wrong on that. But again, you can see these patterns. Now bring it back to something, like, I don't know, tools for our process or whatever it might be. There's all sorts of possibilities here. Here's a game about the Titanic. And so it merges cards with this flip book. And as the flip book goes on, like the Titanic sinks and you're trying to save passengers from the Titanic, or the sinking Titanic. Another game. This is Arkham Horror, collectible card or collectible card game, trading card game, living card game. Get those mixed up. And you'll notice a pairing here. And as you play the game, there's kind of you flip these cards over, and sometimes there's cards below. And this is how the story progresses. And one side is like the way you want it to progress, positive things. The other side is like the negative things. You don't want those to progress or the game ends. So thinking now about card pairings and flipping sides and progressions, like you could think about a culture change game or something, and some of the anticipated positive or negative or healthy or unhealthy like sequences that might happen. So where my head's at, and I think I've said this, but here's the visual to really cement it, is I've been playing all these games. I'm trying to deconstruct and say, okay, what are the patterns behind these games, the card patterns that we can then use and apply back to like a work context? Because this is what I'm really passionate about, how we can bring this sort of playfulness and game-like, things to everyday work activities or complex things that we wrestle with as human creatures. So that's kind of the project I've been working on. Let me stop sharing. I'm going to share again from my other laptop, other computer. And I'm going to open the Figma file so you can see a few more of these patterns here. And I know I'm accelerating my speech patterns. This stuff I'm really excited about, if you can't tell. It really gets me excited. So let me flip back to this file. That was case studies, check. Let me jump into my Figma file here. And this is where I've been capturing and identifying patterns. And what I've been doing is, as I come across a new pattern, say like, here's one, there's actually games that have, like I don't know what you call them, but that red plastic film, and you can hide it over and you can see stuff that you can't see with the naked eye. So I'll grab things like that and say, great, there's a pattern. And I'm, in many cases, I'm having to make up the names for these. So hidden information is what I'm currently calling that. So that's an example. Or, if you add something like a clip, and you can even do this with a paper clip, right? A clip on the side or one of these fancy things, you have like a progress tracker of some kind that goes with that, right? And these are in the bucket of like augmenting your cards with additional things. So that's kind of the column here. I'll come back to some of these. Let's see. If you like get into die cuts and things like that, you can have like a keyhole overlay pattern, where there's a card behind it that has information, but based on the orientation and what you can see through the keyhole, you would see different things. And again, this came straight from a game that has this pattern. What else? The transparent overlay I mentioned. This was one, it was a game. Again, this was a serious game, so it wasn't a board game, but it was using hexagons. Card decks don't have to be rectangles. They can be other shapes. And it has a finite number, like 7 cards for self-reflection. So it's like you put one value in the center and there's 6 cards that orbit it. And one of the things that kind of ties it all together is this border that goes all the way around to kind of say or suggest you're forming a complete set. And it orients with the text and everything else. So there's a pattern there around like a split border. So split being the pattern or the whole is split, but there's a border to bring that into focus. Or here's another example of the split. In this case, it's a split image. So it's when you line up cards and together they form a complete image. So here's an example, old example of card decks that would form a complete image when you line them up. And that's basically the same pattern you saw here with that I showed you earlier. It would be a split image pattern. In this case, it's not just left to right. It's actually a whole mosaic of cards that are split. And while I'm here, here's a great one. This is, I would call this mixer match. And that's a reference to the classic mixer match books from the 1970s, where the flip books where you could mix or match a story, and linguistically, grammatically, it was correct, but it was kind of odd, the combinations. So you see that same pattern with games like Beep Boop, where you're building a robot and you need like 2 legs, 2 arms, a body or a torso and a head. But what exactly gets built in there combined can vary, right? There's different arms, different legs. You can make it your own. So that's an example, or those are examples of what I've been doing. Some patterns are already out there in the game world in name. So splaying or melding is a common pattern that a lot of games use, where as you play a game, you slide things out in a certain way. So if you have a card with a lightning bolt, you can slide it under the starter card with lightning bolt, and you have more of those. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of games that have this pattern. It's a named pattern that's out there. Just there aren't enough name patterns out there like that. So I'm trying to add to that list. One more here. This is staggered layering. This is in a lot of like solitaire types games have this. It was Seven Wonders Duel, a 2-player version of the game I showed you earlier, has staggered cards like this. In this particular mock-up, I'm showing how maybe some of the cards are hidden until you remove those. So like you don't know what these 2 cards are until, basically until both of these are removed. Then you can, actually you can flip over the one that's partially covered and see what it is. Right. So some undo there. Staggered layering, right? So again, lots of patterns that we could talk about. But that's, for later. Just kind of giving you a taste of what I've been working on. I'll do one more here, and then I'll switch to a little bit of brainstorming and how might I use this in my day job. So this is a pattern. So bear with me while I explain this one, but it's such a cool pattern. This game comes from a game called Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion. And when you start a round of Gloomhaven, you have between 5 to 9 of these cards. And these are like the core mechanic of the game, these cards that you play. And what's interesting is every round you have to choose a pair of cards to play. But when you play the pair, you only get something from the top half and the bottom half of your pair. So you have to choose what you're going to use and then what you're going to lose, right? And it may be like, well, I really wanted this bottom half value, but I really need this top half thing now. And it's that choice and that dilemma of the pairing, the forced pairing with, I have to choose what I'm getting from which half of the card. Like it's a really, really interesting choice and conflict. Such a great pattern. I haven't seen it anywhere else other than this game, but like just that feeling of tension and like, what's the right choice and what's the right pairing, especially like when you have 9 cards in your hand and you're trying to pick 2 to play and you're throwing away 50% of your options that you could have otherwise. It's just a really interesting moment, a really interesting choice. All right. So let me flip back over here. And I apologize if you can hear my yard people in the background. They chose this time to come mow the yard. So hopefully the mic is not picking them up. Before I do some brainstorming here, I did in this mural, which I'll share with everyone at the end. I just quickly looked at my shelf and pulled some card decks that you might be interested in. So there's some that are service design specifically. So these are trigger cards to ask you to reflect on service design things. This card deck actually is a free download when you go there. It's the Overcome Innovation Roadblocks card deck. So it's really neat. You can download it for free. X-Plane has several card decks. This is just one I grabbed at random. It's the Barriers to Change. And so basically one side has it uses the flip pattern I was talking about, right? Except what's on the back side is the suit. And so on the front side are all these statements that are resistance to change or barriers to change statements, sentiments. And then you flip it over and you see, is it fear of disruption? Is it a lack of empathy? Like what is the nature of the resistance? And the way you play the game is you spread out all the cards. You kind of stack the ones that seem relevant to your company's situation into a yes pile. And then you start flipping over the ones that you identified and seeing what kinds of themes do we see. So it's part of a bigger system to help diagnose the barriers to change, right? And then what to do about it. This was I believe, a student project from the Service Design Lab. And again, cards don't have to be rectangles. They can be other shapes. This was basically challenge and opportunity cards. So I can't remember which. I think the yellow were the challenge cards and the blue are the opportunity cards. So that's how this works. This is more on the creative end of things, but this is the don't/do this game. And they have 6 suits. So it's kind of like the forced combination pattern I talked about. And the 3 across the top are do what, do who, do why. So create a workplace, that's the what. For 30 somethings, that's the who, why, to reduce waste. And again, you can imagine the random combinations. And then the constraints are don't, make it a one piece object, no add-ons, don't, or, use red, green, blue. So you have these constraints and then you brainstorm within those constraints. So it's like, it's like the force combination plus, 2 sorts of suits in the, or 6 types of suits, however you want to slice it up. The what's worth doing cards for people who are unsure about what's next for them career-wise. This is just a set of reflection cards where there's 4 suits. There's a 5th one they'll come back to in a moment, but basically it helps you identify what you care about, who or what you enjoy working with, what you want to make, and what you need next. And the 5th suit is a not right now, like it's not right now not important. So that's the what's worth doing cards. Paradox cards, they basically did a lot of the hard work of identifying these competing tensions or paradoxes. So top down, bottom up, leading, serving, things like that, group, individual, these common, universal, timeless tensions that we have. So really good deck of cards there. This is jobs to be done cards if you want to do that. Emotional culture deck. So anyway, there's links that you'll have in the mural when I share it at the end. And then I put in 2 sort of roundup. There's lots of these on the internet, but these 2 are particularly good ones. Roundup of more like card decks for serious games or learning or knowledge or what have you. The one on butter came out earlier this year, and it's really solid, really good. Okay. Let's start to bring this to a close. So just show you how I might use this and how I hope others might use this in the future. Again, it's a brainstorming tool. Once we can see the patterns, then we can apply those to different scenarios and come up with options. So service design is a very broad and nebulous domain. So I just picked a kind of a common theme that comes up within service design, which is managing change or change management, which itself is very broad. But for the brainstorming topic, that's what I chose to go with. And I just want to show you some of the brainstorming ideas that I came up with some of these patterns. So I mentioned the flip or the dual side. And so you could have one side that's a pain and the other side the solution. You could also use it for like in a classic Trivial Pursuit sort of fashion, a quiz. And we've actually seen if any of you work in research, a lot of our research presentations, rather than just start declaring what the findings of the research were, the research team will lead with the question they didn't know the answer to. And they'll ask everyone to kind of, do you think it's A, B, C, or D, right? And then everyone does their voting, and then they flip the card and they're like, oh, well, actually the answer was C, and here's what we learned. And it's a way to create more engagement with a research presentation. You could think about like behaviors or phrases or things. So like one side might be, a good way to respond to a situation. You flip it over and here's the better or the great way to respond in this situation. Research questions could benefit from this. So here's a not so good way to ask the question. Here's the better way to phrase the question that's more open-ended and not leading and all those things. Pattern, so the one-to-many, a way to explore potential solutions to a challenge or a way to explore root causes of a challenge, especially if you can have and define ahead of time a lot of like these root causes of the challenges. And then you have people talk about which do they think match. I'm gonna skip some of these. All right, so getting really creative, and this is another pattern from the game Gloomhaven, which I haven't played all that often, but when I played it, just struck me with some really cool patterns. So they have these monster cards. So when you battle a monster, only one wedge. There, you can see there's like 4, symmetrical wedges. Only one wedge is peeking out from this envelope, right? So you slide the card into the envelope. Because of how it's die cut, you only see one wedge at a time. And the reason they did this is as you advance through the game and level up, they want the things you meet to level up in their own abilities. So it's more, so they can keep the challenge ever increasing. And so at different stages, you might be asked to rotate this, and slide it in so you can see the numbers increase, right? So it's a more challenging monster or creature. So many things from this, but if we literally didn't stray too far from what we see here, you can imagine presenting people with the whole card as a type of challenge. And then there's, each rotated direction is like a type of resistance you might encounter, right? And that you can talk about. And when you feel good about level 1, you can up and say, well, here's the next wave. How would you handle this? And you can increase the difficulty of your discussion questions. Or maybe it's the same challenge, but each side's a different group, how different groups might respond to this challenge. Again, going not very far from the theme of change management for brainstorming. Change management sometimes has to do with I'm gonna drill on this lower idea, change in process. And one of the things I've learned, so free Steven Anderson wisdom here, if you try to roll out a unilateral, like this is the way all teams must work, and I'm thinking about like product teams, tech teams, I've yet to see that work. And the reason those types of things usually fail is because they're very prescriptive and heavy-handed around how teams should work. It comes from a good place, right? We want all teams to work in a consistent way. So if you rotate from one team to another, things are coherent and consistent. The problem is it gets very prescriptive, and they start to tell you like, you must use Daisy, and another team uses Racy, and another team uses AAR, right? And these different things that accomplish the same thing at the end of the day. And so I was thinking about card decks and tooling and processes. And here's a game where it has that complete image. But you'll notice it doesn't all exactly match, but it is, among the nose cones, there's different nose cone options. So it's like a blimp or hot air balloon. There's the lift engine. So these are the things you have to do. And I'm going to translate this to a team. You have to do these things as a team, but how you do it, which tool, which method you use is really up to you. So let's say, for example, customer blueprints are required of teams. Well, some teams are going to be in a case where that's too high level and they need the next thing down, which would be like a task flow analysis. That would be a comparable tool. So as long as you have something that accomplishes this objective, and it can be one of these tools at one of these altitudes, we're cool with it, right? So maybe cards could make that literal for folks. You can read through these on your own time if you're interested. I'm skipping a lot. Here's another pattern. This is from a story generating tool. And they did a few things here. So they put text on each of the four edges. So similar to that Gloomhaven pattern. So you have different text, but then they have different suits and they string together to form a sentence. So there's another pattern here in terms of linguistic continuity. And so it's a story generator. And so in this case, you might, based on how you orient the cards, it spells out a story starter for you. So a survivor wants to expose the secret of a paradise corrupted, but their commitment will reject them. And you can see how if you rotate it, survivor wants to expose the secret of a forest, beautified, but and it's a story starter, but you see several patterns here. Force combination we talked about. So going back to that progress tracker, one idea there, I was like, how would you translate progress tracker to change management? Well, I went through a change process a year or two ago. And one of the things that was brought up was this activation curve. And everyone was asked to, after the changes were rolled out, to kind of identify where they felt like they were at on this change curve, and there's similar things like particularly if you're going through grief or something, there's the Kubler-Ross model, right? So what if these were on a single card and you could put where you're at, and maybe on the backside you had a question like, what would it take to get you to the next level, right? What's the barriers? And this was a conversation starter. Also another tip here, cards don't have to be like multiple cards. You can have everything on a single card. Did a challenge with the Mighty Minds Club last month or 2 months ago, which was a single card serious game challenge. What can we do with just one card to make a serious game? So lots more ideas. This was just, brainstorming. How can we apply this? But hopefully that gets the sparks going, gets you excited, and seeing how there are so many creative possibilities once we take the time to see patterns beyond just 50 cards. They're all, alike. Oh, all right. I've done enough monologuing. I'm going to turn it over to questions, comments, thoughts, and reactions, and then we'll close. I'll share some links and things. So,
thank you, Stephen. We had a lot of very engaged people who've been talking and chatting and sharing other decks as well. So we are going to be capturing all those and put them into the YouTube comment section when the video is up tonight, just if you're looking for all that wonderful worth. But now we're going to ask you a few questions, if it's okay with you, Stephen.
Sure.
Robin, do you have the first question for Stephen?
Yes, and actually we'll just touch on one thing because I think a couple of folks were actually asking about the mental notes cards and if there's going to be a reprint or how they might get a hold of those. I know you covered that earlier, but let's revisit.
Yeah. How about, let's say it here. I'm going to commit to doing a 15th year anniversary Kickstarter early next year. You heard it here.
You heard it here first.
I'm committing.
Yes.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Groundbreaking.
If you know how Kickstarter works, to start something now and all the prep, it'd be like Christmas time before it'd be launched. And yeah. So I think like February or March of next year makes sense to launch it and get it done by end of the year. So you heard it here. I committed.
Very exciting. All right. I'll take it further and jump to, we have a question from Christina. How do you approach tiles versus cards? The same, different?
I think there's, if I'm going to draw a Venn diagram, there's definitely a significant overlap. I believe the affordances of tiles are a little bit different. Like I have a project that in my mind, it has to be tiles or it has to be coasters, right? And because the tactility of it, be able to easily grab it and move it. And with cards, like I've seen card versions of tile-based games and just grabbing and moving things, like just the human affordances and the usability of those are different. So those would be the things that I would put at the outer edges of a Venn diagram. But in terms of a lot of these patterns, yeah, I think a lot of them do apply. But it's more about the tactility of it and just how you can grab it off the table and hold it in your hand. And yeah, those would be the differences I would look at. Good question.
Brendan, do you have a question for Stephen?
Yeah. Got another kind of pithy one, but Daniel asks, so when is your book that encompasses all of this going to be? You're working on anything?
Yeah, so just full candor, I am hoping between now and the end of the year to start writing up a lot of these patterns. Like you saw them in Figma file, there's not a lot of text there, it's still up in here. But I want to get ahead of the writing and then maybe in January, February, do the email newsletter thing, but an email newsletter focused just on how cards work. And basically every week share a new pattern and examples. So that's what I'd like to do. And then at the end of the year, after I've gone through like 50 patterns or 60 and, there's something written, look at options for like a book or a toolkit, right? And I feel weird, like part of me wants to like a coffee table book out of this with all pictures of examples. The other part of me is like, if this wasn't a card-based toolkit on how to use cards, I've done something wrong. So I've got both of those ideas in my head, but mental notes reprint ahead of those.
Dungeon
That's
Master
awesome.
Guide for cards.
Yeah.
And before Brenda leads in with the next question, I do want to mention sort of the top comment, I think, of the day from Christina, which is, this talk is going to cost me a lot of money.
I've done my job then. Yay. I see John Wilshire here. John Wilshire hosts Cardstock meetup every month. And every time I go to that meeting, I walk away like with, yeah, it costs my wallet, my checkbook, definitely. So shout out for Cardstock.
Brenda, what's the next question?
Yep, awesome. So a question from Ben Judy, and I'm gonna read the question is, let's say I want to find a card deck suitable for a team activity or problem solving exercise. Where can I go to quickly find a suitable deck? Is there a catalog or system design for decks that you will recommend?
I would say it feels very fragmented right now, just the card marketplace in general and how to browse decks. Deckable.com was a site for a while that was cataloging cards, and there was a little bit of organization, like a few tags, but it still feels very fragmented, especially when you really get to intent or outcome. There's two ways to think about that, or two ways to respond. I wasn't sure what you're asking. One is an existing card deck I'm going to buy or look at to solve a problem. And that's the question I'm answering first. With the toolkit I plan on coming up with, I would look at start with the nature of the problem, and it would guide you to try one of these 3 or 4 patterns that might solve it. That would be a big part of using these effectively. And there would be a precursor to what's the problem? How might we flip that into a how might we statement? And from that how might we statement, what are the properties? Is it time? Is it people? Is it what? And then that would guide you to the right pattern that you might try with some examples. So that's what's in my head for picking the right pattern for a particular application.
So, and just to clarify, you're gonna share the mural, right?
I will. In fact, let me just keep an eye on time. Let me do that real quickly here. And I'll walk you through what this will. I'm not sharing a link directly to the mural. What I'm doing instead, just so you know, it's nothing devious. I just put in the Slack a link to a Google form. Just ask a few questions on this topic and the feedback. Everything's optional. So if you just want to get the link to this mural, you can just click submit, leave it blank, and you'll get it, right? But if you have feedback for me or questions or something, there's a chance to do that. And in the feedback or in the form, there's an option to sign up for the How Cards Work newsletter, which I mentioned I might launch in early 2024. I already have some content written for that, but it's mostly the book openers stuff. So the link to the mural and within that survey, the option to sign up for How Cards Work, that I just put in the chat. I'm going to make another offer too, because I'm still like, a lot of my learning and my thinking has been shaped by actually helping people with card projects. I have friends who've been designing cards, and just it's the benefits both ways. So I'm sharing what I know, but I'm learning from them as they ask questions and we explore ideas. So if you're working on a card-based project, feel free to book time on my calendar. I may regret doing this, but hopefully not. You're all good people. Let me see. Let me get back to the chat here. Well, I'll paste that in the chat in a minute, but basically cal.com/StephenPA, and you can book time on my calendar, and we can talk about a card-based project, and I will share my thoughts, give you feedback. I've done this with a number of friends, and like I said, the benefits go both ways. And then finally, if you're interested in a community that's formed around this stuff, we're still in kind of an alpha. We're testing the different tooling, but a private alpha. But you can go to themightymindsclub.com and sign up. And it's really a community for people who make or would like to make playful things to think of, and not just card decks, but like canvases and models and simulations and full-blown games and all sorts of things. And that was just born out of the need to connect a lot of friends from across domains that I was meeting, across disciplines, but to create a center of gravity for people who like this sort of stuff and felt like serious games are very much video game focused, and facilitators are focused on very facilitators, designers are focused on design methods. And so I just want to create a place where people could cross boundaries and geek out about card decks and canvases and frameworks and things like that. And then if you, I am on Mastodon these days. I think I did this wrong. I think it's @StephenPA @Mastodon.social, but this is where you can find me. All of these links, again, if you go through the Google form, it gets you to the mural, which gets you to all these links. So that's if you're excited. And if you thought this was a waste of time, I apologize. And this is not for you, and that's fine. But yeah, if this topic interests you and excited you, that's how to continue the conversation after today.
So Stephen, we're almost out of time. I'll be respectful of your time. Do you have time for maybe a couple more questions? If
yeah.
Some. Brandon?
Yeah.
Robin? One more question?
You're up,
I'm scanning them very quickly. Yep. Okay, I think we've got a question here because a couple were answered in chat. Nikita asks, you had mentioned that through an app or in general online, the possibility of the cards allowing for conversations organically might not be possible. How do you think organic conversations or game flow can be achieved for hybrid organizations, or let's say people who are far away and can only connect online? It's a good question for someone who works for Mural.
Yeah, let me elaborate on that. And what I was holding up was like, if I built this as an app or built this as a Google form, I would have to go with A or B, right? Maybe another, I might add, that's kind of the wiggle room, but it's very like, you have to code those sort of rules into it. If it's in real life, like the photo I shared, or if it's in a digital whiteboard like Mural, people can like create a category C or D or whatever. Like it's like a digital whiteboard, right? It's a drawing tool, and you can collaborate in those more organic ways. And so I was just trying to highlight the contrast between building this in a app driven way and just the constraints it would enforce versus building it in a way that allows for more just, messiness, right? Human messiness. And that, by the way, just speaking personally, like we focus a lot at Mural on visual collaboration and how to help people collaborate. And it's an eternal tension between how do we bring in more scaffolding and just enough scaffolding to help people be successful at these things, but also not be so rigid that we don't allow for the messiness and the human dialogue and the conversations that come out of these things.
Very cool. Brandon, do you have maybe one more question for Stephen? We're going to be trying to capture all that. There is a lot of conversation in the chat, trying to capture all that and share with Stephen, so Stephen can actually kind of follow up with you if you want to. And also a lot of resources that were shared by people I can see, for example, lots of good additional decks were shared by some people here.
I'm anxious to check that out myself.
Yeah, Christina has a lot of things to say about cards. We have a lot of people very excited about this. One more question, maybe Brendan.
Yeah, I'm actually going to pull from a sort of an inline conversation that we were having where some of us were lamenting that we get a lot of these. Sometimes we'll buy them, we get intrigued by them, we think they're fascinating, and then they sit and we don't use them. And there was some conversation about why do we get really excited about the concept and then not use it? And I have a theory as a consultant that perhaps it might be a little bit easier in-house to create workshops where you're using this kind of activity to workshop. Might be a little bit more of a struggle for consulting, or is that just all smoke and mirrors? Like, what do you find are the reasons that you do or do not tend to use these kinds of tools to facilitate your activities?
So I'm gonna answer that in two ways. So as a collector of these things, you might notice in the photo, some were still in the shrink wrap. So I am guilty of acquiring card decks that I haven't even opened yet. I'll admit it, but things I facilitate, again, it's not, can I use the card deck? Like there might be a few times I do that, but by and large, it's like, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the goal of this time together? And how can we best accomplish it? And so often that will lead me to backing into like, well, maybe there's an activity, a card-based activity, or it doesn't have to be card-based. It could be something else that we could try. So it's always starting with the outcome we're after and working backwards. And that's led me in many cases to create card-based games just because there are so many possibilities there. So like the Fact or Belief game, I'd given a presentation and we had done through the slide where it's like, it's easy, right? Now go do it. And I realized it wasn't easy. And I was getting asked hard questions. I'm like, it's time to make this a discussion game. So yeah, working backwards from real problems and the outcomes you're after, and then either creating or finding the right game would be what I would say in that case. But finding, like I said, a lot of card decks out there are the laundry list of methods or the laundry list of techniques. There are a much smaller number of cards. They're actually facilitation games like I'm describing. And the ones I mentioned, I think are all pretty good at that, but that's a smaller set of those.
So I think we may have one more question for you, Stephen. Obviously, we're going to be running out of time here, but if you have time for one more question, Brandon.
One more.
Last question.
Good.
Yes. So Yuri says, I'm intrigued by the recipe cards pattern. Like the example that she's putting is one card containing a representation of a small collection of other cards. I would love to hear more of a possible example or use scenario for those.
Yeah, so anything where you have, it's a one-to-many options. So the yoga was the first place I had seen that. Now I've seen it in a few other places, I feel like. But the pattern is when you have lots of options. So let's take the case of like you're trying to roll out a culture change, like change management project, and they're different. You have the index cards might be specific tensions you've noticed or specific issues. So I'm making this up on the spot. Let's go back to those 6 from the Explain card deck, the 6 barriers to change, their diagnosis. So maybe now you have 6 recipes cards. So if the barrier to change is something about empathy, then look at these cards because they have empathy in common, right? Or if the barrier to change is this, and what that allows then is like one card. So card number 53 can be linked to from like the empathy index card recipe, but it can also be linked to from one of the other types of barriers, right? So barriers. So now you have this one-to-many sort of relationship that lets you go through and find many possible solutions to a particular diagnosed problem. But those solutions don't have to map to one; they can map to many diagnosed problems.
Cool. Well, Stephen, as usual, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It's always a lot of fun to have you around. We have a lot of like more difficult topic. I would say it's always good to actually have somebody like you come over and kind of like, hey, everything can be fun, right? We can actually do some facilitation. Can be like, it doesn't have to be like difficult conversation. And we talked about conflict last week, which is also very difficult. But like, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your knowledge and your love for the board games and the cards. We had a really interesting chat. People were really into that. So really happy that this would actually strike a nerve. Thank you so much. The recording will be available tonight or tomorrow morning on YouTube. We will try the best we can to capture all those links and the mural board and all the stuff that Stephen shared with us. Steven, as always, lovely to see you. We need to do lunch in person eventually, since now COVID is almost over. And we need to do this more often. We need to talk more about like some cool stuff that Design can do, and not always the drab, difficult, stakeholder interview stuff. Thank you so much, Steven. Have a beautiful day. And then thank you all of you who have joined us for this session. And then we will see you next time. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks all.